Hello, hello, hello. Good morning, colleagues. So happy to have you all here. Great to see you. We're just waiting for the fourth panelist, Megan. Megan is in the after talks of the accountability talks. So let's give her a couple of minutes and then we'll kick it off.
You've got a couple of chairs on the edges over there for those standing. And there's one chair there also.
Good morning.
My name is Rachel Thompson. I'm an executive director on the board of the Asian Development Bank, representing 11 of the bank's members, including Australia. With Asia and the Pacific facing a generational confluence of challenges, the international community is calling on MDBs and IFIs to do more, to act more quickly, and to mobilise the resources at our disposal for greater development impact. Now, when ADB was established, I think it's fair to say our models of development assumed a degree of linearity. If that was true then I think it's a model being fundamentally disrupted by climate change now. The kinds of problems that our clients are going to need us to help them solve are going to be increasingly complex and require us to do things we haven't done before, potentially that no one's done before. And if we're going to engage with risk like that, then it's really imperative that MDBs and IFIs foster a culture of continuous learning. That means embedding systems and strengthening cultural norms that generate early and real-time insights and that allow lessons to be socialised and applied on a continuous basis. This will be critical to the ability of MDBs and IFIs to effectively respond to climate change. Because if we can't learn, then we can't replicate new solutions. And if we can't replicate, then we can't adapt or move to scale quickly. And when we do things for the first time or with new modalities or technologies, early learning insights can really help us deal with some of the uncertainty that we will inevitably face. That's particularly important for decision makers, including board members. And as a board member myself, I absolutely believe that IFI and MDB boards need to be in learning mode ourselves as we seek to govern these institutions through a really challenging time. Of course, post-completion evaluation, be it of individual projects or across sectors and themes, will remain fundamentally important. That's not least because of the important role that it plays in the accountability of these institutions to shareholders, to clients, and to the communities that we are ultimately striving to serve. It's never been a more important time for us to rigorously demonstrate the value of what we do and the impact that we have. And evaluation units are really on the front line of that campaign. Because if we don't have an early sense of what is working and why, then how can we best allocate scarce resources to greatest impact? I'd suggest that's always been true, but it's taking on a new importance as we seek to address climate change. And while that is a global imperative, we know it's a battle that will be won or lost here in our region. With that, let me hand you over to the panel and wish you a great rest of your week. Good afternoon. I hope you're having a great day as Asian Evaluation Week kicks off for 2023. My name is Rachel Thompson. I'm an Executive Director on the board of the Asian Development Bank, representing 11 of the bank's members, including Australia. With Asia and the Pacific facing a generational confluence of challenges, the international community is calling on MDBs and IFIs to do more, having a great day as Asian Evaluation and to mobilise the resources at our disposal for greater development impact. I'm an Executive Director. Now, when ADB was established, I think it's fair to say our models of development assumed a degree of linearity, including Australia. If that was true then, with Asia and the Pacific then I think it's a model being fundamentally disrupted by climate change. The community is calling on MDBs and kinds of problems that our clients are going to need us to help them solve are going to be increasingly complex and require us.
Well, okay. That's what's needed. Well, the messages about learning on evaluation is so important that it was worth double down. In 2008-9, you remember that huge crisis, financial crisis. I was with the World Bank at that time, and the World Bank was gearing up to disburse $100 billion to help countries overcome the difficulties that we were all going through. And in evaluation, independent evaluation, three colleagues, including Stoyan and Vino Thomas at that time, we took the bold initiative of embarking on a real-time evaluation. It was the first time among MDBs, never before. And the difficulties to convince everyone, not the board, but management especially, was dramatic. It was the first time that an MDB was attempting to do this. And we did this. We went ahead with the exercise under the conviction that we have to, and we had to, at that moment in time, learn from the evaluation point of view about what was going on. It could not be possible that evaluators as us could just sit down there and watch $100 billion being disbursed and do nothing. Just watch, because the idea, the mental model, was that we had to wait until things were done to learn, to assess, to evaluate. So while I fully agree with Megan's point, at a point in time I said that my last name is accountability. While I fully agree with this, I also fully agree on the need to learn from evaluation. There's no contradiction between both sides of the equation. And today, we have a great session to talk about the learning side of evaluation, but on a very special dimension. Early learning, just as with real-time evaluation. Early learning. Let's not wait until the end. You know, now when we send a message through our phones, we're expecting a response immediately. And if half an hour has gone by and we don't get a response, we get anxious. Well, why don't we have the same anxiety about learning from evaluation, early learning, while things are happening? That is the subject of this session today, and we have a great cast of speakers this morning to address this subject, early learning, learning in action, as we call it. Veronique Salce-Losac, we shared the leadership of the ADB Independent Evaluation Department, and we did a lot on this, and she's continuing doing a lot of this at EBRD. She's the chief evaluator of EBRD. We have Megan Kennedy, whom you just heard her talking about accountability. Now she will talk about learning too. That's the balance. She's the head of the evaluation unit of OECD. We'll hear from Irene Bain, my colleague, head of learning and evaluation in AIIB, Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, for those who are not familiar with this young organization, and you will hear why this approach is important for a young organization. And Ricardo Polastro, who is the Chief Evaluation Officer of WHO. They all bring very interesting perspective to our table from the humanitarian point of view, from the private sector point of view, from a young organization point of view, and from a collective organization as OECD. With this, colleagues, let us kick it off. This is the plan. We're going to have some explorations on the challenges, the approaches that have been used by each of the organizations. And then we'll talk about a little bit about methods. I'll stop in the middle of this conversation and entertain your questions. Please have your questions or comments ready. I'll stop in the middle of it. We don't have to wait till the end. And with this, let me first invite Ricardo to tell us a little bit about the difference about early learning and early learning exposed, the challenges that you have faced working a lot on the humanitarian side of development. And share with us, please, your perspectives in this sense. Ricardo.
Thank you, Marvin, and thanks for inviting me to join this panel. It's really a pleasure to be back at the Asian Evaluation Week after we went into that Zoom mode for 3 years, and being back face-to-face in the modality so that we can interact and learn from each other. So first of all, the distinctive features. So the distinctive features, the first element is that I would say these are rapid, light, flexible, dynamic tools. I mean, the real-time dimension gives also a dimension of interactivity. There's such a wealth of stakeholders. So there I'll bring you to the first point of reflection, that the dichotomy between learning and accountability is false. without accountability, it's very difficult to learn. And without learning, there's very difficult to walk the bridge of accountability. And these are two sides of the same coin. Now, it depends where do you put the weight of the coin. And in real-time evaluation, the weight of the coin often goes into what is a more learning dimension. Now, what's the difference between these? These real-time evaluations give immediate feedback, and this feeds into decision-making. So that's the first fundamental distinction. In traditional evaluations, what you have, normally you have evaluations which feed into the next phase of the intervention. So it's very linear. And then you've got the ex post evaluations which come when maybe the patient is already dead, right? And there's a reflection, a post-mortem in medical terms. So you learn and examine the past. The relevance of what you say for the future sometimes is weaker. And there's been a huge interrogation, especially in crisis settings around this. Because in crisis settings, the utility of a function such as evaluation needs to be very, very succinct, very light. It has to feed back into different learning loops. And as Patricia, who is with us today, describes, there are double, triple feedback loops that are really interactive throughout the evaluation process. It's not a one-off. Normally in an evaluation process, which is more tilted to accountability, the independence has such a weight that you often lose the learning dimension and the interaction with the different stakeholders. You don't manage to engage throughout the process in a lively way. And there are a number of examples. This applies to the humanitarian sphere, the development sphere, but it goes also across the systems of learning. And we've got some interesting examples. Right now we're evaluating our strategic plan in WHO, and at some point we were mandated to do this evaluation. It had to feed into the design of the new GPW 14, which is the Global Plan of Work, which is a 5-year plan that gives the overall strategic direction. And we decided also to insert some real-time learning in it, because the people developing the GPW 14 are developing right now. How did it work? The team leader interacted much more as a facilitator and gave timely feedback as the document was being revised before it went out to consultation to member states. So we had the first iteration right now. But this has applied also during COVID, throughout the pandemic. In a number of organizations, there's a wealth of experience. And then you can look into natural disasters, into conflicts, protracted crises, where the turbulence and the volatility is much more extreme. But the thing is to keep in mind, they're versatile, they're flexible, they're adaptable, and you can engage. The commonality is yet you need to engage all the stakeholders, and you need to be clear in the intent. Now, what approaches did we take? Now, there's specific methodological approaches to real time, and they mainly rely on qualitative information. But you know, as you're all familiar with mixed methods, you can have qualitative that you then combine with quantitative and then again with qualitative. And that is a modality that Michael Bamberger, that was here at the Asian Evaluation Week, noted on real-time evaluations we did back in the days in Pakistan. So the other dimension, you have to be really light and have the speed that conveys into the decision-making, because the decision-making is a window of opportunity. You don't wait for decisions to happen, especially when there are fast-changing environments, and we've all experienced this. During the pandemic has been a governance crisis. So how do you take decisions in the midst of an operational fog? How do you engage stakeholders? And often there's an absence of baseline. So you need to have a really light footprint and adapt to the different audiences. And the evaluator needs to be a facilitator, engaging the different levels of audience. You know, the field, the regional level, the headquarters dimension, the donors, the UN agencies, the Red Cross movement, the NGOs, the national government, the local government, the stakeholders, as Megan was referring to, which are not passive recipients. You need to engage them because you all are so accountable to them. So how do you learn out of this experience? And then you also need to feed into the response or into the implementation of your intervention as it goes, so you can adapt it. You don't have to wait until things are over. You can go on the go, tailor, swifty, and that then links into modalities which are derived from planning, which are closer to monitoring. And the evaluation as a sphere expands its anchor so that it can fully inspire others and be relevant to the moment. Otherwise, the function is at risk of dying.
Thank you very much, Ricardo. We tend to think of a real-time evaluation more applicable to the humanitarian side of development, right? And actually, that's where it was originated. But more currently, we are applying this to a broader context, as I said, to MDBs for the first time in 2009, and now is we are seeing all organizations applying this approach. But does this apply also to private sector evaluation? Veronique, you have this double experience, right? That we live together through the crisis in ADB. But now you're also looking at private sector evaluation, and I know that you've done some work in this respect. Can you talk about this experience?
Yeah, thank you very much, Marvin, and also just a word to say that how delighted I am to be here in person. I have not missed one of the 8 Asian Evaluation Week, and to be back and see all of you in person is really a treat. To respond to your question, Marvin, it's true that when I moved from the Asian Development Bank to the EBRD, European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, in a way I moved from a development world to a more private sector world. And it was during COVID-19, so it was in the midst of this crisis, and we were still all working remotely. And right away, I was embarked into this real-time evaluation that EBRD had already started launching, very closely with ADB at the time, because the Independent Evaluation Department of ADB had been really the pioneer in starting this real-time evaluation of the support of our institutions to the COVID-19 crisis. So it had started when I arrived, and I had also learned a lot from what had been done in ADB. I see my colleague Eric there, who was one of the leader of the work on this COVID-19 RTE. It was a different context, of course. Not that EBRD had not experienced crisis before. It's a region in Europe where there were a lot of crises, 2007, 2008 financial crisis, the Greek debt crisis, the COVID crisis, and now we are also in the middle of the war on Ukraine crisis. And there will be more crises. And so it's not that it was new for EBRD. What was new was to try to have real-time information about how EBRD was implementing its package, and whether they were doing well or not so well. I have to say that the culture of evaluation is by nature different in a bank where you have many bankers. And there are not development people working on financing projects. They are bankers who moved to being more in the development field. We actually don't use the word development in EBRD. We talk about transition, meaning more transition towards a market economy. And that was also for me something to try to adapt to. This real-time evaluation that was ongoing was important because EBRD had been the first IFI to react to the COVID-19 to ensure that there was a support to the private sector affected by the crisis. And the objective was to avoid the liquidity crisis or to mitigate the liquidity crisis of the private sector in the region. But it was completely new to board members. It was completely new to management and operation. And as for other institutions, you come as an evaluator in the midst of the crisis. Everybody is overworked. Everybody is rushing to try to be helpful. And saying that you are going to conduct an evaluation can be perceived as an intrusion or an additional burden. And it's not necessarily welcome. And I know that my colleagues had to deal with that, the fact that it was not necessarily welcome. So in RTE, I would add one element that, on top of what you said, Ricardo, of course, it's making sure that it's an ongoing process, that we get engagement from everybody and that we get feedback and we evaluate as the package is being implemented. But it's also very important that the evaluation itself is short, that it's not something that ongoing, it's not a monitoring process. We need to try to capture as much as possible about early learnings in a short period of time. And that's what we did in the evaluation department at EBRD. That means that it took just a few months to come back to the board with some early findings. And of course, also one element of importance is to make sure that you don't raise expectations. It's not a post-evaluation. It's not an evaluation that will give you all of the depth and the wealth of information that you can have when the activities have matured, when you had time, what I would call the luxury of time that we sometimes have, to wait for a project to finish or program or a policy to be implemented, then to look back and then to have a lot of data analysis and come with some lessons. It's early lessons. We have to be humble as evaluators to know that they are not necessarily the final lessons. They are the lessons that we can capture at a certain time with the type of information we can capture in real time. And we came with this in mind, thinking that, of course, we wouldn't give solid recommendations. So we came with findings, with insights from our evaluation, and then it was a bit tricky, but rather than call them recommendations, we called suggestions. And that was a way for us to say, okay, we are not sure they are the right ones, but that's what we get from this early information, early evaluation. And the process itself was, I found, very important for the learning aspect. By, from the beginning, saying it's not going to be mandatory recommendations, we started having management and operation more engaging. They were more open to talk to us. They understood also that we were there to help and not just to scrutinize everything they were doing. We also made it very clear that we were conscious that in times of crisis, you don't do everything right because you have to act rapidly. And that the suggestions will be mainly for a learning process. And I have to say that it worked particularly well. We presented the results in January 2020. And another aspect that I would like to highlight is the way you present the results. It was not a thick report. It was a short, concise report, short and crispy, and we even presented it in a short video. So that was also the message, is that it's quick, fast, it's key information, raising flags where it's not going well and saying what seems to be going well. And that was accepted with more openness from the management than I think if it had been a heavy report. And we proposed also the suggestions. And there was a talk at that time among board members who said, could we transform these suggestions into recommendations? So we had planned with management to do that. And then February 2020 happened, and that was the war on Ukraine. So another crisis. Everybody switched directly from COVID-19 to the new crisis. So we had to make sure that everything was turned into an element that was about crisis, not just about the COVID crisis. Our report, our recommendations and suggestions were about how EBRD could be better at managing crisis. And because of that, management actually called us, maybe pushed by board members, but not only. And they called us to say, okay, can we really meet rapidly now? And how can we see how the suggestions from the COVID-19 experience can be turned into something that we can use in the design of the new program we are putting together to support Ukraine. So I'm giving you all of these details to show the process and the small elements that actually made it different from another type of evaluation. It made it sharp, it made it fast, and that really helped a lot the learning. We are following up on this real-time evaluation on COVID-19. We did follow up with a counterfactual analysis. So going back to what happened, and then having a group control, and a control group, and a group of banks who benefited from the support of EBRD, and we are comparing the impact of the package that EBRD proposed. And very often, I would say that a real-time evaluation should be or can be a phased approach. You do it once, then you look at what you can do in a second phase. We did the same with the war on Ukraine. We already provided some input from our real-time evaluation of the support to Ukraine. And now we are looking at what else we can do in a short period of time to provide some more early learnings. So maybe I'll stop here.
Thank you very
and I
much.
can give more
Great,
details.
great. So far, we are creating a picture there of evaluation, not only in real time, not only applicable to humanitarian activities. We can see that it can be an interesting and useful instrument in other circumstances, including in EBRD, as I said, ADB. Let me now come to Megan. When we started this exercise of a real-time evaluation in different organizations, multilateral and bilaterals, strikingly, at this point in time, in this second global crisis, many thought that it was important to do real-time evaluation. Not so, as I said, in 2008, 2009, that was complete mistake in the views of many hardcore evaluators. I saw it with happiness now that the perspective had changed for this latest crisis. And OECD, under the leadership of Megan, launched an initiative, the Global Coalition for Real-Time Evaluation on COVID. And so, Megan, you have also a very interesting perspective to share with us, not only from the side of multilaterals, also bilaterals doing this exercise. And can you please share with us what you saw and what you are seeing, because the exercise has not concluded yet.
Yeah, thank you, Marvin. And it's maybe helpful just to clarify that at the OECD, we don't actually conduct evaluation. So I'm a step removed from all of the colleagues here who have shared about their experience. And as the OECD Development Assistance Committee Evaluation Network, we actually have two sister networks. The Evaluation Network of the Multilateral Banks Independent Evaluation Group, Independent Evaluation Units, and the United Nations Evaluation Group. And so in March and April of 2020, we began responding to requests from our members as they were all scrambling to respond to the emerging pandemic. And it became very clear very quickly that this would be a very significant international response in terms of development cooperation, providing assistance to many countries, including OECD countries that were receiving assistance from others. So it's a very multilateral international response, even at the same time as OECD governments were mobilizing domestically to respond to their own challenges. And so what we realized at that moment was that as evaluators, we needed to support our members, but we also saw that we were missing, perhaps of the 3 sister networks, we were missing our 4th big brother, who was the evaluation counterparts from the partner countries, many of whom are all of you here sitting with us today. And we realized that in a crisis like COVID, which is so universal, all governments were struggling with evidence, with understanding real time what was working, what was not working, and there was a huge opportunity to create more efficiencies, to share learning, and to speed up that feedback cycle by working together. And so we launched the COVID-19 Global Evaluation Coalition, and that brought together all 4 siblings of those different evaluation stakeholders. It's open to any country that's interested in learning and doing credible evaluations to support pandemic response, not only the health response, but the broader socioeconomic response as well. And it also involves then, of course, many development agencies, UN agencies, and all of the major regional banks and multilateral banks, as well as the IMF. So our strategy was sort of a phased approach, because as the colleagues have said, it was a crisis moment, but I think it's also important to distinguish between a crisis and urgency, because not everything that's a crisis has to be done tomorrow. And the same goes for humanitarian. So many humanitarian assistance interventions have been ongoing for decades. So not just because we're working in a crisis mode doesn't mean everything is all urgent at the same time. And what I saw happening across the OECD was that every department working on every area of public policy was busy producing a new brief, COVID-19 pandemic and my policy area. So COVID-19 pandemic and evaluation, COVID-19 pandemic and education, COVID-19 pandemic and small enterprise development, gender equality, etc. And you see this just volume of advice flowing out of the OECD. That's just one organization. And I'm imagining now the World Bank is also over here producing evidence. And you start to wonder, how do we expect people who are operating in crisis and now working from home, and myself, I was working 3 jobs at the time, so I work at the OECD. I had a 2-year-old, that's a daycare, that's a full-time job, and I had a 6-year-old who is also in 1st grade, that's my 3rd full-time job. So I'm not a mathematician by training, but I think 3 divided by 1 is not a good sum. So just taking my own experience, but I know many of government partners, as well as development agencies, we're all working under extremely constrained circumstance. And at the same time, they're being bombarded by advice from every angle. And I think that's where, as Veronique said, this being humble and being aware of the audience for our evaluation recommendations is so important. And thinking about, can they actually use the information we're producing? Because it's not just the goal to say, ah, look, I've published on the website my PDF about evaluating in times of COVID, and now I feel very proud. But who actually has the capacity to download that and read it and use it? So we took this phased approach. And our idea was a bit, if you can imagine a graph that has on the bottom axis time and the source of evidence. So at the beginning, we said, okay, we don't have evidence about COVID-19 itself, but we have evidence from the 2005-2007 financial crisis. And I think this brings up the point about not just accountability and learning, as Ricardo said, but being accountable for learning. So in many ways, COVID was unprecedented. But at the same time, it's not as if we had no clue, right? So we know when children are out of school, the rates of unwanted pregnancies among girls will go up, right? We know when the unemployment rises and families are under stress, that violence in the home will go up. These are things that we know. And so our strategy was to take evidence that we had and to try to get it into decision makers' hands in a usable format. And the nice thing was we had a very good entry point. So the United Kingdom and Canada were convening development ministers every 2 weeks on particular topics. And they would call us up and say, okay, 2 weeks from now, they will meet and discuss gender equality in education. What do you have? Yikes. Okay, so now this makes evaluators very uncomfortable, right? Because what they want to do is say, ah, yes, let me call 3IE and commission a 18-month synthetic review that will give us a very long report about everything we know about gender equality. By the time that comes out, as Ricardo said, the patient will be dead. So we tried not to make the perfect the enemy of the good. And we scrambled, and we worked to get all the evidence that we had from evaluations. One lead agency would take the lead. UNICEF, in this case, took the lead. What evidence do we have? What would be the 4 or 5 key messages that you would like to give to development ministers on gender equality in education. And we pulled those out, and we gathered from across the room, and I remember once a colleague from IOB Netherlands, the evaluation unit of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Netherlands, he was going on vacation, and he said, okay, I have until tomorrow at 4 o'clock. I'll see what I can do. And he spent the entire day just going through all of the evaluations they had and pulling out evidence about gender equality. And that way we were actually able to fit into the binders. When this group of 15 development ministers sat down in the room, they had in front of them a policy brief that was 4 pages long that gave our top messages, lessons from evaluation. And I'm really proud of what we did there because it was not easy. And like I said, a lot of evaluators felt very uncomfortable. I know maybe we've been a bit criticized. At the same time, we were able to make an input into real-time decision-making as it was going. So that was the first phase. We worked on trying to get evidence from other crises and other experiences into the decisions as they were unrolling. Then we shifted to the second phase, synthesizing and sharing. So we tried to create a platform. So ADB shares their real-time evaluations. That's inspiration to others. We pulled out the evaluations that were emerging and started sharing them across different partners. And we did a synthesis. And here again, we borrowed from the ADB's traffic lights. You know, very simple traffic lights. Evaluators often don't like traffic lights because it's too simplified and we don't get a chance to put all the caveats about the strength of the evidence and the causal relationships, etc. But at the end of the day, we know all of our politicians respond well to traffic lights because we can say, this seems to be going well, this we have some concerns about, and these are things that are going badly and need attention for action or change. So we used that during the synthesis phase, trying to actually pull together the evidence and amplify the learning across partners. And finally, we entered the third phase, which is actually evaluating the COVID response itself. And there we tried again to support efficiency. We created a set of 6 common questions that was developed by all the 60+ members of the coalition together. And they were structured around the evaluation criteria of relevance, effectiveness, efficiency, coherence, impact, and sustainability, but tailored to the pandemic. And our hope is that those questions could be used by different partners in different contexts and generate more evidence that would then be more synthesizable across. We also supported coordination. We launched with the support of the UNHCR, the governments of Uganda, Colombia, and Finland, a major international joint evaluation on the protection of refugee rights during the pandemic. And that evaluation was launched in the summer of 2022 and provided really interesting evidence on the global efforts on protection of refugees during the pandemic. And now we are in the phase of really taking stock at a global level. We've launched a strategic joint evaluation of COVID-19, and I can tell you more about it. I give a shameless pitch for a small reception we'll have after tomorrow's session in the evening. So we'd like to tell you more about that strategic evaluation then. But this work is ongoing. I know we're all tired of talking about the pandemic, but as my fellow panelists have said, it's not just about pandemics, it's about applying the lessons that we can apply today to international cooperation and to public policies. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Megan. We've been talking about early learning or real-time learning in the context of a crisis to be more effective and use our capacities as evaluators on time. But what about if your operations have not concluded yet? What about introducing evaluation in your organization that doesn't have a clue of what this is? What can you do in these circumstances? Now we'll hear from Irene about the experience of AIIB in using early learning evaluation for a young organization. AIIB is 7 years old, and operations just now are coming, the first ones are coming to completion stage. But evaluators could not just stand there and wait 5 years, 7 years until the operations could mature. Early learning was introduced in this case, which is basically formative evaluation. Much of what we heard about the Chinese case is formative evaluation. Irene, tell us a little bit about how we have used this approach in the case of AIIB.
Thank you very much and welcome everybody. As Marvin has said, let me shift the dial a little bit from a sense of crisis around COVID to perhaps what was initially, we thought, another sense of crisis. When I joined AIIB in 2017, it was the first operating year of the bank. The bank had a charter that empowered us to do evaluation, and it was programming from day one. So what do you do if the model is post-evaluation? You have an option to wait 5, 7, 10 years. But if you are already programming, there was a need to do something earlier for 2 reasons. Firstly, because our business model, we had said, was to learn through doing. And it's easy to do and hard to remember when you're doing things fast to learn. Because institutional learning is intentional. It's not serendipity, it's not opportunistic, something you pick up along the way. You need to plan it from the start. You can't get to the end and suddenly think, what did I learn? At least we have found that's very hard. So the first was that we wanted to learn through doing as part of our business model. The second, as a new institution, you want to build your culture. Now, if you do nothing, you will have a culture come up, but it's maybe not the culture you intend. Building the culture you want, and particularly a learning culture, takes real work, because although AIIB was new, all of its staff came from other places. They had other ways of thinking, other languages for thinking about it, and something that you'll hear us touch on in some of the sessions, why we took the OECD DAC criteria and made it into a booklet that showed how we would use them in AIIB was we found people used the word impact in different ways. They used the word development, efficiency in different ways. So as we thought, we have this opportunity before we post-evaluate later on, how are we going to use it? So it's not a challenge, but an opportunity. And something I'd like to emphasize is what we did by creating what we call early learning assessments is we think we've attenuated the relationship between learning and accountability. When we do a post-evaluation, the project has finished. There's the chance to look at the dead bodies and ask why and what could we have done better or what things did we do well. But in the implementation phase, you have the chance to look at things in a different lens. And so with early learning assessment, what we did was to say, let's develop a process. You can find that process in this booklet here because we actually put it in as a structure that will show how we, through early learning assessments, we want to do a pilot to see, can you get to accountability through learning? Not just, as Megan said, to be accountable for learning, but will your learning take you to a better quality of accountability? And so we developed a process of early learning assessments. Now, what this means is we use something that we have in ADB that's a very important tool for us, that from our charter and our articles of agreement and our board's initial understanding came an expectation that our unit would be independent but engaged. And so we've thought a lot about what does independence mean in that situation. And perhaps more than being independent, it may actually mean being impartial, because in our unit we also have two other functions for anti-corruption and for project-affected people's mechanisms. And then separately in another section of the bank, we also have internal audit and we have external audit. So we have a lot of lenses looking at the what and looking at accountability for the what. But in terms of the how and the why, we felt that was still an area where there was an opportunity for us to be part of building a culture of evaluative thinking. Not just that evaluators are the only ones who think, but we know our colleagues are busy. They don't necessarily have the tools and the language. So how could we go beyond a process of just doing the early learning assessments to use them as a vehicle for building a deeper culture in which the bank as a whole learns? And so if you have the chance to read our learning and evaluation policy, you'll find it says that at AIIB, learning and evaluation are shared responsibilities with distinct roles. We play our role, but that doesn't mean management doesn't have a role. It doesn't mean the client doesn't have a role. If it's a sovereign project, the sovereign entity has a role. Now, very briefly, every year we select 1 to 3 early learning assessments. We have our own best idea, then we hear management's ideas. We select, but management gives their suggestions. And we choose the projects based on their significance and the capacity to learn lessons. Then what we do is we work together with the project team to go to the field, to look at the project, and to engage in an extended dialogue to understand how they see the project, how the client, how local communities see it, and we start to form an impression. We draft a PowerPoint, we share our initial thoughts with management, and then later we draft a first draft of the early learning assessment and then subsequent drafts. But what is really important in all of that process isn't the products. That to me is the big shift from doing a post-evaluation. It's shifting to process, not necessarily process evaluation as Marvin was saying, but a process of engaging with the other people looking at the project to try to extract lessons, understandings, share perspectives. And something often very interesting comes out in that what you find is project teams have concerns, observations. They may not be able to get them higher up the system. And so where we look at something, and if we objectively find that we share that perspective, we can lend our independent lens to pass the message up. And getting that, as Rachel said, messages passing up and down the system, particularly for a young bank, is really important. We don't have country offices, so making sure those messages move is really critical. And it's that process building and processes that build the bank's culture. And so what we've seen as a bit of a shift in the dial is teams coming around to accepting what we're doing. They're busy, so they won't accept heavy-duty interventions, but going on mission with them is something they're doing anyway. They value what we see. We don't always agree in our early learning assessments. Management has the option to debate through the drafting process, If we still don't agree, it goes in as a footnote to say that management has a different opinion. And ultimately, our early learning assessments go to the Policy and Strategy Committee of the board. They're also circulated to the full board. So they serve to join the dots between the different levels of our institution. So we're talking about the same problems, looking for the same forward-looking solutions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Irene. Perhaps one important detail, Irene, that is critical in this process is that we don't publish the pieces so that we can facilitate, motivate interaction in the organization.
Just on that, maybe to add, that was absolutely a specific intention to create a safe space for learning. So we got a derogation from our board under our public, our policy for
Disclosure,
public
right.
information, not to disclose.
Very good. We got a picture here, right? So of what this is all about. Let me open up at this point in time the floor to hear your comments, your questions, your doubts, for those who continue to be skeptic. And so I see several hands. Please identify yourself, be brief if you're making a comment or ask your question, and please indicate to whom you're addressing the question. Here first, please. Do we have, yes, mics?
Good morning. I'm Romulo Miral from the House of Representatives in the Philippines. My question is, how is a real-time evaluation different from rapid appraisal? Because that's something that and in fact, I just checked my Google, and there's a lot of things written about rapid appraisal. So I'm just wondering, how is real-time evaluation different from rapid appraisal?
Very good.
Thank you.
Excellent, excellent. Let me take three comments first. Please. Do we have another mic? Or higher speed in delivering the mic?
I'm Sanat Manage, representing Save the Children International, so based in Sri Lanka country office. So this is really a good topic for me. So then I have a couple of questions for all the panels. So one thing is, this is really seems to be good for the humanitarians and short-term project, and also it's good for the private sector. So when it is come to the development projects, usually it will take 3 to 5 years. And also in the evaluation, we are mostly look at outcome level result, right? Mm-hmm. Outcome and impact. So how it is going to measure those things? And also the evaluation has to be done by independently, right? If you call evaluation EP, then there is no recognition EP done by the one agencies. And also it's going to be, seems to be a costly, right? So if you're going to do the real-time evaluation, and for the, as a SCI practice, Save the Children practice, so we also practice in those things like monitoring, evaluation, accountability and learnings. But learnings we practice in different way. For the project as well as the organization, we develop learning agenda. Through that learning agenda, we identify learning questions, right? Even the individual projects, couple of learning questions. So those learning questions incorporated with sometimes with the evaluation questions, and also sometimes we have the real-time learning, right, platform through the accountability, feedback mechanism, as well as the reflection event, and PDM, post-distribution monitoring, those kind of things. Thank you.
Thank you very much. One more over there at the end, please.
Thank you. First of all, I'm Stefan Dahlgren, from independent consultant with a former life as Swedish evaluation at Swedish Development Agency. First of all, thank you very much for extremely interesting experiences. My first comment or questions is about monitoring. how do you distinguish this from monitoring? It may be easy for professional evaluators as us, but for the, say, recipients, so common public or whatever, you don't really may see the difference between monitoring and evaluation. And do you see any problems with this? Would people think that, well, this fast evaluations, we can skip monitoring, or do these two concepts have different uses? Second question or comments is, even if your experience is extremely interesting, I think it's generally a very unevaluative account of fast evaluation. There is no critical comments from any of you. So what do you see would be the disadvantages with this? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Very fascinating questions, and so some of your questions are moving ahead of our next round of questions to the panelists. So we have a number of questions here, right? How do you distinguish between rapid appraisal and real evaluation? How do you deal with outcomes impacts? How do you incorporate learning during this process? How do you distinguish between monitoring and evaluation? What's the difference between both, right? And any disadvantage? Let us park the question on disadvantage, issues, challenges for the second round of questions, so that we can hear from everyone. A critical question as evaluators. Of course, we have to be critical. Right, it's part of our job too. So we didn't forget about that. We'll come back. Who would like to start? Megan.
Yeah, thank you. It is true that we did plan to come to the challenges next. So I guess on the question, maybe mixing monitoring and real-time assessment, and I don't know if this is a shared perspective, but I don't think it matters very much. If I can say that. So whether you call it real-time evaluation, whether you call it monitoring, whether you call it real-time assessment, whether you call it paying attention to what we're doing, I don't think that's necessarily the concern. And I think two reasons for that. One is, as evaluators, we're not the only people who should be evaluating, right? There's a difference between the noun and the verb. So just because you're the evaluator doesn't mean that the program officers who are doing it should not also be constantly evaluating. And I find that they actually maybe are the ones asking more critical questions. Because if something's going wrong with what they're implementing, for example, then implementers will be very concerned about what's going wrong or why we're not seeing the impacts that we thought we would have. So I wouldn't be too orthodox. I don't think it helps us very much to be very orthodox on the different languages. And different terms, maybe people react quite differently to them in different cultures and institutions. So I think the important thing is to use the words that give meaning in the context you're working in, whether that's to focus on learning or whether that's to focus on accountability. For me, also the main distinction, and there was a lot of challenge around it, is whether or not monitoring is just looking at what's happening, whereas evaluation is trying to bring in the judgment element. So you may say we've constructed 5 kilometers of road, but is that enough? Is that good? Is that efficient, etc.? So I think that's, for me, the real distinction between monitoring and evaluation. We have tried to define all of these in our glossary that I mentioned earlier. But my main message would be, one, don't try to be the exclusive holders of evaluation. Try to encourage everyone to take evaluative approach to their thinking. And two, don't get caught up on the words, because at the end of the day, what really matters is what speaks to people and what can give you an entry point to helping people learn.
Thank you very much. Irene, and then Veronique. Yeah?
Just to the question of monitoring, because as you know, in MDBs, we also have large monitoring departments. One of the things that we do in an early learning assessment before we go to the field is the desk review. So we go through all the project monitoring. And as Megan has touched on, what you often find is a lot about the what, or maybe a patchy account of the what, or maybe different accounts if it's changed team leaders or perspectives. And so when we do our early learning assessment, we focus, yes, more on the how, on the why, on the value addition, the relevance, and so forth. But we also very often, given we're a new bank, give very specific recommendations back to the monitoring team in terms of information to be collected. In some cases, we mentioned the need for doing more analysis of trends rather than just producing large amounts of information, because as Megan touched on earlier, who do you produce monitoring data for? In the first instance, you produce it for people who are going to use it in the bank. Therefore, it has to be usable. And when we come along as the early learning assessment, that's often a reality check on how usable what's being collected is. And that goes then to the OECD DAC evaluation criteria on efficiency. And that's where often our recommendations in an early learning assessment come. Are we being efficient and effective in what we monitor, how we collect it, how we convey it within the institution, and as my colleagues touched on, how we use it for adaptive management? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Irene. Veronique?
Yeah, thank you very much. I fully agree what was said. I would add maybe 2 points. First, I agree that terminology should not be too dogmatic. What is important is to keep in mind the objective, which is to collect evidence and to have evidence that will feed into better, into learning, into better decision making, into higher performance. And it's true that EVD, as you were saying, Megan, not EVD, but independent evaluation in general, doesn't have and should not have the monopoly of evaluation. So it's important that also the one implementing, operating, also have their own internal self-evaluation process. And the way I see it is that when you are from an independent evaluation department, what is different is that you bring a different perspective. You bring an external view on what is being implemented, and that's very complementary to the monitoring, which is, to me, more for the team to keep in mind. And we're less embedded in the project. However, I understand that there is sometimes a need for clarification of the terms. And I have to say that I suggested to the Evaluation Cooperation Group, where you have all of the heads of MDBs, heads of independent evaluation MDBs, at least for some of them, coming together regularly. And we've proposed to lead the working group on clarification of RTE, rapid assessment, and all of the same, to see how we're going to use it, what is the best use of it. And that leads me to the second point, which is real-time evaluation is not the panacea. We are not saying that it should be used instead of ex post. It should not be used in all type of environments. And let me also rehabilitate the art of autopsy, which is the art of looking at a dead body. Because I don't think that it's a dead body in itself. When you look at a project that has been implemented, let's say the building of a big infrastructure, you do need the time to make sure that there are impact and results, and also unattended effects that you can look at. So coming at the end and looking ex post at the implementation and the effectiveness of a project is, in a way, still very important for learning, because there will be more projects. So we're still fitting into the learning loop. It's not because it's exposed that it's not fitting in learning loop. It's just a longer time learning loop. And in that case, it's based also on the wealth of data and more time to analyze the data. And yeah, we will talk about these advantages in the second round, so I won't go too much into it now.
We're coming to that now. Ricardo, any?
Yeah, let me just not go into the distinction of evaluating infrastructure and social interventions, because that would open for another session. But I think you raised some important points in terms of what are the distinctive features with appraisal, with monitoring, and then if you take it from a vertical logic, not the results-based management cycle, but the type of interventions, that move beyond activities and inputs, but go at the output and at the outcome and impact level, then the measurement also differs. And how do you measure these? And what do you have in place? What architecture is in place to measure, especially on the ground? What do governments also have in place? Because if we are development partners as such, we need to support and use that infrastructure, not duplicate and multiply that infrastructure. But it's quite interesting to see how in the midst of the crisis, a number of governments around the world did real-time learning using a combination of what were rapid appraisals, and the methodology is very fast also, but the purpose of the appraisal is different from the evaluation. And on the monitoring too, there are some distinction features, and I think Megan did a carpet distribution of the OECD DAC glossary in the previous session. For those of you interested in the distinction, there is a definition there, so let's not elaborate on that. But I think what is really, really important also is if you find yourself in a context where there are no baselines and you need to take decisions, what do you do? Because that has been the case in a number of contexts that we've all experienced. And if you find yourself also in a non-linear environment, and today as we emerge more and more and we face VUCA, where there's this volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and you need to work around it. How do you address these things? Let's think about climate change. Climate change is really not a one-off event, it's over time. How do we intervene around that? If you look also around migration, and what kind of tools do we have? Now, there are some boundaries that in some contexts, some institutional contexts, are very important to respect. And you need to identify the points of convergence between these different tools, some that serve more for the planning phase, other for the implementation, other for the strategic direction. So you need to see how do these ally and work together, the points of convergence. But also, if you're in an environment where accountability has now a lead role, you need also to see the points of divergence. And the independence steps in. And how do you work at arm's length? So it depends. The team has to work in different configurations, also according to the context, and what is the object of the policy, the operation, the intervention that you're trying to address, and how are you going to address it as a whole?
Thank you. I'm not a panelist, but let me just say a word here, right? Just to clarify on this point of rapid assessment or not. Rapid refers to the speed of and the depth of the analysis. And it can be on ongoing operations or post-mortem too. So it's clearly different from real-time evaluation that is an ongoing type of evaluation. Rapid can be of exposed to. Right? And for those of you who have seen a monitoring report of an MDB, it's full of data of what is happening. And those of you who have seen a real-time evaluation, you see that it's a more in-depth type of analysis, as Irene was describing with the early learning activities. So there is a absolute clear difference and distinction between both types of products. But let us go now. I'm sorry, I think somebody else, yes, burning questions here before we move forward.
Hello, good morning. Thank you so much for acknowledging. I'm Arlene Flores from the Philippines. I'm with the Commission for Culture and the Arts. My question really is on budget. So I'm from the government. Is there a formula or a ratio that we should consider or observe in allocating budget in the entirety of a plan or a program? Because, well, as practice, we're not observing any. And if there's a magic ratio, then we would love to know so we could assert and really robust our initiatives much more that we're doing real-time evaluation at now. Thank you.
Ratio for what? I'm sorry, I didn't follow.
Ratio or a magic formula for allocating budget for evaluation.
Ah, for evaluation.
Yes.
Right, magic.
Thank you.
We all like. Let me cover that in the second round, because time is running here, and ask this very fundamental question on challenges and issues that you have faced in undertaking this type of evaluation. And let me follow the same order here, and let's be a little bit briefer this time. Perhaps we can entertain a couple of questions at the end, and start with Ricardo once again.
Okay, thank you. And so I think the fundamental challenge today, and as we've seen in the past, let's say 5 years, is what has the evaluation function to offer? That's the fundamental question on the table and the challenge. What is the added value of an evaluation function? And I know we can defend this among us in the room, but outside of this room, the different stakeholders, the decision makers, the policy makers, the people responding on the ground, the people affected by crisis, what do we bring as a difference? And here, we've talked about the burden dimension. There's been a multiplicity of these exercises. How do we work together? Is it about creating parallel systems that each development partner asks for? Different accountability needs, different learning purposes? Or do we work around integrated, around more national dimensions that we feed into better empowerment of the national government, better empowerment of local communities? I think that's one of the fundamental challenges. The other dimension is there's a growing tendency to describe any evaluation as real time, which I think is wrong. You know, not every evaluation is real time, and Veronique was referring to phased approaches, and there are also different modalities, and these can complement each other. It's not the flavor of the day, real time. You know, real time has kicked in back in '92 with the Kurd crisis back in the first Iraq war. So that was real time that Jeff Crisp launched back in the days in UNHCR. And it's expanded throughout a number of sectors. I mean, the Norwegians worked on climate change back in 2008. The Norwegian government, I mean, across the humanitarian sector, there's a wealth of real time. But if you look at all these crises, these evaluations, if they're not conducted at the right time, they can become wrong time evaluations because they really miss that opportunity to influence the decision making. So I think that's the other challenge, the inflation of real time and the multiplicity of wrong time evaluations that then are tokenistic, ritualistic, box-ticking, and you name it. The other dimension is who initiates and who owns the evaluation. And if we go back to our famous, inspiring anthropologist, Robert Chambers, is whose reality counts, no? And who initiates and who owns the evaluation? Who's the evaluation for? What do we want to change in terms of the process? How do we engage those different stakeholders? And Megan, before you were talking about the upwards accountability, which seems to be a dominant tendency in a number of actors, donors, multilateral banks, but how do you really empower communities where the change needs to happen there? How do you get all the stakeholders work together? Because it's not having a multiplicity of stakeholders at the table, and that's the jointness dimension. How do we, the shared learning, and Stefan, you remember Niels Dabelstein, that when he was chair of EvalNet and OECD DACT, talk about the importance of doing these exercises collectively and jointly So you have a more system-wide approach and not an individual accountability, bean counting kind of modality. The other dimension is the lack of experienced evaluators. And finally, to bring you to the table is the budget dimension. You were raising this, the funding. Do we have funding readily available on time? Because if you need to feed into real-time decision-making, you need to have people that are able to do these, but you also need to have the funds and the modality. It maybe also needs to be reflected in your policy. Because if not, the people are going to scratch their head and ask you, what are you trying to do here? Are you trying to do an appraisal? Are you trying to substitute my monitoring function?
Thank you very much. Veronique.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yes, of course, when we look at challenges, we need to remember why we undertake a real-time evaluation. And usually we do that because we want to continue to be useful as independent evaluation. We want to be able to contribute, to support the institution, the country, the communities that we work for. And for that, we have to pick when to use real-time evaluation. It's not for all situations. It's really when there is a need for early findings that can contribute to the decision-making or to a better implementation of the project. And some of the key challenges are also opportunities. One opportunity is that we act fast, but what does that mean, to be fast? You know, it should not be at the detriment of the quality of the results, because otherwise you undermine your own credibility. So it's important that even though you are fast, you collect the right data, that you have a methodology that's solid enough to bring some elements that are going to be credible enough so that they can be used. So it's not about just impressions. It has to be grounded in evidence. But of course, that's a risk because there are not so many evidence or data collected in times of crisis. So it's each time a balance between methodological rigor, making sure that we are still doing our work, which is evaluation. It's not just impressions, again, of what's happening. It's not just being an advisor. It's providing evidence-based information. And you have to be agile. So fast is not enough. You have to adapt to the situation and not just be quick for the sake of being quick. You have to understand what are the information that are requested. You remember the COVID-19 crisis. First, it was more about the medicine. It was more about making sure that the virus was not spreading. But then it was about support to the private sector. It was about much more embedded crisis because the COVID crisis lasted. Another key challenge is to manage expectation. I mentioned it a bit earlier, is that if you go to board members and say we're going to do a real-time evaluation, right away they have a lot of questions that they would like you to respond and to answer. And you have to manage expectation that the real-time evaluation is not going to bring solid responses on all fronts. And it's not going to be the full picture either. So you have to be clear about what it is and what it's not, what type of information you are going to bring, and what you cannot cover. Impact, it's not something that will be covered by real-time evaluation. Relevance, processes, efficiency, yes. And early effectiveness, hopefully. You also have to be careful not to add a crisis to the crisis, and not to be, in French we have a tale that's the mouche to the fly of the coach, you know, which is, there is actually a truck that's in difficulty, and then you have a fly going up and down and saying, oh, you should do this and that, and at the end say, phew, it's good that I was there because they would not have managed without us. But that's not true. It's, we have to be there not to be the fly, but to really provide actionable information that will help and not to add burden. Another point that I would like to add is that we have to be conscious that there is a potential bias towards what is not working when you do a real-time evaluation. It's easier to see what's not working, and it's useful. But we might just raise the flag and say, well, we might not have all of the elements to see how what is working, but we do identify what is not working. And you have to I would say keep in mind also that in evaluation, what we want is also to be able to draw lessons that will be useful for replication. So not specifically for one crisis, for example, but more broadly. And the key points is to make sure that you have these learning loops working, because it's good to say that's the intention, it's for learning, but do we have the mind space for learning at the time you bring the information? So it's all of these elements that you have to keep in the balance. Yeah,
Thank you very
I will keep it
much.
here.
Okay, Megan.
Yeah, I see time is running, but I did mention absorption capacity. I think that is a key one, Stefan. I think just to highlight then quickly 3 other challenges from our experience. I think something's come up a lot today is the time question. And I have to agree that this issue around when is the right time, and also what actually can you evaluate, which level of results are you able to evaluate, because it's not just because it's ex post at the end of a project, you still may not be able to, it may still be too soon to really look at the longer term outcomes. If your goal is to decarbonize the transport sector in Thailand, you're talking about change processes that are going to take decades. And we always have a very short time span in terms of both implementation and evaluation. So I think it's a bit of a false flag or a straw man to say that that's a weakness for real-time evaluation, because I think it's actually always a challenge. But that doesn't mean you can't look at other aspects of results that are already appearing. I think in our approach, one of the real challenges was around a potential for groupthink, and that you kind of have a confirmation bias. So when you're working at speed, you tend to, I think it's an interesting contrast actually to the point on seeing negative results, is that you tend to confirm what others are seeing. And on the one hand, that provides some comfort, because the lack of, you may not have a lot of evidence, but if the preponderance of evidence is going in the same direction, that's a reassurance on one hand. On the other hand, I think it also means maybe we're missing something. And finally, I think the real challenge that we saw of trying to do things in more real time was the lack of ability to benchmark. So if you read the evaluations of the major multilateral banks on COVID, they almost all say, and the bilaterals as well, they almost all say we were fast. But fast compared to what? Fast enough? I don't know. And some of them then started to try to compare against each other, which is helpful. But it's this question also of, well, what does fast really mean, and what was required? And so I think that issue around benchmarking and how we can benchmark is a real challenge. Yep, thanks.
Thank you very much, Megan. And now, final word here, Irene.
I think absolutely the time is the important one. That, and also scale. What we found with our early learning assessments is they have that rich anthropological value of being in the field. They don't scale up very well. And something we've had to work hard with our board, particularly, who now likes early learning assessments because they get lots of information. They'd like to use them for everything. And so we now have, in a sense, the challenge of our success to remind them these early learning assessments are for projects in implementation. At project completion, you will still have the post-evaluation, the independent post-evaluation. Now, what is the relationship between those documents going to be? That, I think, is an area we could think about more, to show they're not either or, but to show there's a continuity of them. In a way, in my mind, I think of it as the difference between anthropology and sociology. They're both people-focused, but your early learning or your real-time assessment gives you a granularity. Then when you come to the post-evaluation, you can look more broadly. A final cautionary note I would give, though, that I've observed even with our process, that when you want to be fast, you need to manage 2 elements really carefully. If you're working with consultants, you're going to have to recruit them, and the bank's processes may not go as fast as you would like to go. At the other end is all of us in this room have, I would guess, been to university, fallen in love or not with the idea of writing essays and believing that it's, at the end of the day, the product, the way it was written, how many pages, how the cover looked, you can start to get distracted off your process into product. And that really slows you down. The value of an early learning assessment for us is that dialogue and that being in the field to do it. Don't compromise that to other processes, packaging up to a beautiful product. That's not what they're designed to do. Quick and effective.
Thank you very much, Irene. We've heard rich expressions about the value of early learning here from our panelists. I'm not trying to summarize, but just to make some final reflections on this. For those who continue to be skeptics about early learning, I would assimilate it to trying to build a hospital dedicated to long-term care only and no emergency services, right? Obviously, life is not predictable. It's not about long-term care only. Emergencies happen constantly. We have one in the region currently. And evaluators have to be able to contribute and change their mental models, adapt, and bring some value, as I have seen being added by evaluation work through so many years that I have been working in this field. Actually, early learning is nothing else than an enhancement of the value of formative evaluation. Those who think of ex post only, I mean, they're thinking only of summative evaluation. And who says that that's the only purpose of evaluation? Formative evaluation plays a fundamental role in our discipline. And early learning is just a variety, a perspective of a formative evaluation. We have heard from our excellent panelists that for formative evaluation in the sense of early learning, it has to be adaptable, it has to be versatile, flexible, fast. It has to feed into the decision-making process, or else it doesn't make any sense. It has to be short. It has to refer to not only to what, but why things are working or not working. We have heard that it's not only applicable in terms of emergency, urgency circumstances, but it can be used on regular basis as AIIB is doing it currently. We have heard that for this instrument to be useful, engagement is fundamental. You have to engage with those who are conducting their evaluation. You have to be respectful of those who are executing the operation, absolutely respectful to this, conducting the operations on the ground, and empathetic with these colleagues who are in charge of delivering in the end for the organizations that we work. I think it's been a very useful, rich discussion. We need to thank our panelists here for their contribution, and I would invite you to please deliver exactly that very warm bit of applause here too. I'm sorry, I know there are more questions and comments. The panelists are available to continue the conversation, and myself as well, of course. Thank you. Huh?
Before coming to the magic formula, I just come to the idea from auditing perspective, wherein the accountability is ensured through government auditor called Comptroller Auditor General of India. The entire budget expense of that office, the charge
Thank you very much. Maybe you can exchange. India has a long experience on this as well. And still so, we made it to the 12:30 mark. So thank you very much. Have a good lunch, and we'll see you in the afternoon.
Hello.